Well, my name is Peter Dobers. I'm professor in business studies. My fields of research interests have been sustainable development and collaboration. I have held, besides being a professor, leadership positions at several universities, mainly as the dean of the faculty board, and the last 5 years at Södertörn University. I am the current president of ISDRS, and let me just say a sentence or so about ISDRS and then continue with Södertörn University and my main points for tonight. ISDRS is an international society for worldwide scholars in sustainable development. We have been around since 1992 and have held annual conferences at 27 occasions, been on 6 continents while doing so. Södertörn University is located in Stockholm, south of Stockholm Center. We are a young university, have only been around for 25 years. And while all the other 18 universities are located right in the city center or to the north, we are the only university in the suburbs of Stockholm. And that is also a very important element of our identity. We offer education and conduct research in humanities, social sciences, technology, and natural sciences, often with a multidisciplinary and intercultural profile. Well, next to the challenge of coming to grips with teaching and learning in a COVID-19 setting, many state-run authorities and universities in Sweden have had an economic challenge as well. In Sweden, the Swedish Pensions Agency, calculating pensions payments for all state employees, have not anticipated our increasing life expectancy well enough. So Södertörn, as many other universities, right next to the COVID situation, have been doomed to pay much higher premiums since 2009 and for the next few years. So that has been a burden as well. When taking a broader perspective, the education of more than 220 million university students have been suddenly disrupted by university closures from March 2020 and onwards. Only recently in Sweden, 440,000 university students and 70,000 university staff have actually been back to universities and our campuses for 4 weeks after the summer break. While most universities in Sweden have had some mix of welcoming students on campus as well as online, all restrictions have now been lifted as of October 1st, 2021. This is obviously not the same in other countries around the world, but I certainly wish for students and faculty to join in on academic teaching, learning, and research, regardless if made possible on campus or online. 19 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, the world is still a planet on which many nations have hardly any access to vaccines, and only a minority have a high number of residents having taken their second shots, and some countries even awaiting their so-called booster shots number 3. The pandemic and the social and economic responses, they are amplifying social inequalities and hampering the strategic long-term investments into Agenda 2030 by firms and governments. And from my perspective, I reckon a couple of aspects at this moment. Low-income groups are obviously once again most affected by the economic consequences of the coronavirus crisis, such as has been the case for many years when environmental crises have turned. The second point is that the pandemic is reducing the ability and willingness of firms and governments to make strategic investments that are so desperately needed, and that we have to deploy huge resources to ensure a sustainable recovery from the crisis, not only in our own nation, The idea of sustainability itself will be transformed, and we need to focus on individual and community elements of well-being, flourishing, and community. And the crisis changes the view of mobility. We have seen that already, but also of migration as part of this transformative years ahead of us. As part of the global education response to the pandemic, UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank have conducted a survey on national education responses to COVID-19 and their closures in 2020. Upon this, the UNESCO section for higher education has provided an evidence-based overview of the current situation of the higher education system at the national and global levels. And the survey, which in itself was made available online December 20 to February 21, had a reply rate of about 30%. 57 countries out of 193 replied back. So let me just conclude my talk with sharing very briefly 10 points of their conclusions. First, mode of teaching and learning. The major impact of COVID-19 on teaching and learning is the increase, obviously, in online education. And the hybrid teaching mode is the most popular form by that. Second, access to education. The impact of COVID-19 on enrollment varies by region and income level. Again, high-income countries and countries in Europe and North America are far better able to cope with a disruption, not only through government funding, but also an increase in domestic enrollment. Third, international mobility. Obviously, mobility has suffered a major setback, affecting international students significantly, but virtual mobility could compensate or at sometimes replace physical mobility as well. And that is why the Society of ISDRS will forthcoming always try to include an online path to join our conferences as well. Fourth, university staff. Despite the closures of many universities, actually, the impact of COVID-19 on university staff compared to the previous academic year is limited. That is what the UNESCO reports say. But let me add from the knowledge I have from Södertörn that many teachers are very worn down and tired despite the summer break they've had, and they're really torn down. Fifth, disruption of research and extension activities. COVID-19 has caused this cancellation and the suspension and delay of many teaching and research activities globally. And that is a setback, of course. Sixth, widening inequality. The mixed impact of the pandemic on many different universities and their funding has shed light on the exacerbation of inequality in higher education. It is not many countries that have a completely state-funded university system, such as Sweden, for instance. So the support from government and other external sources are in many countries crucial to the survival of higher education institutions. 7, university operations. The strong impact of the pandemic on higher education institution operations has caused reduced campus maintenance and services and campus closures worldwide. And as we know, campus costs remain with or without students there. 8, national challenges. Health and adaptation to new modes of teaching are the primary concerns now for many students and institutions. 9, the transition from higher education to work. The significant reduction in job opportunities coming back now in some countries, however, makes the transition from higher education to the labor market more difficult. And obviously, employers are seeking applicants with advanced tech skills and online skills that not all nation states and students in all countries have. And 10, national priority to overcome the challenges caused by the pandemic, many countries have a need to improve the infrastructure and availability of digital devices for online and distance learning. But if I may add, we must not forget that the basic pedagogic conditions for teaching and learning are more or less dependent and independent, on digital devices. And for those of you who would like to read the report in full, I will paste the direct link in the chat just as of now. Well, that was for host and panelists. I will put it up for everyone as well. There we go. So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to address you.
Professor Peter, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for those insights. And I think we've learned a lot already from that. And we definitely have questions that we'll probably leave for the end. And with that, would love to transition to Ms. Katrin Gebhard from the from France Embassy in DC. She is the higher education attaché, and we're honored to have her, and would love it if you introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akil, and thank you so much also Professor Dobers for the introduction. And I'm sorry, I should be in. Okay. Yes, so I'm born and raised in Germany, and I transitioned to France over the years. I did my master's first in France, and then I stayed for my professional career in my new host country. And as of this summer, I also have French citizenship, which is a great step for me personally. But it also overall, it had allowed me to represent France in the United States. So my perspective here is today representing as an administrative and expert for international higher education, because I've always been in international offices, working on student mobility and other kinds of issues, and presenting mostly a French perspective, a little bit of German, and a US perspective, as this is where I'm based today. When we look at France and when we think about how, yes, the current crisis, or we're not sure how much it is ongoing, offgoing, ending at this point. So it is a very interesting point to have this discussion today. So if we're wondering how this helped us both to develop global cooperation among international institutions and among centers of higher education, and how this all relates then to sustainability, which has become an issue even bigger and even more important in the former years. We can see as of today, when we look at France, that students are mainly back to campus, which is great news because everybody seems to be eager to get back to campus. And we hope that 90% of those students will be vaccinated in the next coming weeks. Which is also a great number, and which gives us the feeling of, yeah, this might be as normal as it gets. And the question now is, what is the new normal, and what have we learned, and how can we better integrate definitions, issues, and questionings around sustainability with that? If we look at French higher education and what has happened during the pandemic, it's very hard to generalize, and even more so generalize on a European level, of course. In France, we saw different issues arising depending on the types of institutions we have. Those serving highly diverse student bodies had to deal first with the digital divide and put in place programs to provide computers to all students in need. Others, typically our colleges and graduate schools specialized in business, engineering, or public administration, we call them Grande École, the big schools, had more support staff for the tech part and for transitioning to some online learning and online teaching. Factors like the type of lessons and even the field of study impacted the ability to switch quickly to online education as well. Interestingly, in France, we use a lot the term pedagogical continuity when we speak about the transition to virtual education or to online education. So this framing helped us a little bit to focus more on really student outcomes and what students need, because there should we beyond all the disruptiveness and beyond all the changes that have been there. One attention, and I really joined Professor Dobers on that, has been on widening inequality and low income groups. Whereas we first talked a lot about how can we teach online and how can we translate that, we then went also into seeing that a lot of groups, they actually like basic things like food. And what has happened in France is that the public university cafeterias, which are not handled by each university, but are handled by like intergovernmental agency, they now offer meals for €1 per meal. And that's, it hasn't been very much before. It was like maybe €3 or €4 or something like that. But still, the reduction has been very significant, and that has been something very popular that happened during the pandemic, because there was more attention for this vital needs and basic needs of students. Interestingly, compared to American universities, I would just like to say that the French public universities did not implement individual mask mandates or vaccine obligations or things like that. So here in the US, we hear a lot about like how many universities asking now for mask mandates, or what are the vaccine obligations when you go back to campus and these kind of things. And we didn't have this kind of discussion in France, because the universities just relied generally on the guidance provided by the ministry and the health authorities, and they do not take individual decisions like that. Still, the question remains, did the remote studying approach prove helpful or effective? We might not know yet. As Professor Dobers mentioned earlier, one of the big questions is how will students transition to the job market? And that is a big question for those who started studying in 2020. And we will not see until in maybe 2 or 3 years how this pandemic has actually impacted their learning career and their learning overall in universities. Remote studying was necessary, and maybe it was an opportunity to try out different versions. Everybody was forced to do so, which is sometimes it's like a major, or it was like a major large-scale experiment where we try to find out what kind of online education works best, under which circumstances actually. And the degree of satisfaction of students, which should be one of our main measures to evaluate the efficiency and of our move to online instruction, varies considerably from one institution to another, from one class to another. We learned that lectures intended for large audiences can be provided asynchronously and with other supporting materials, that smaller formats with a high level of student engagement can work well. And this is even true for international education, and when we speak about programs of virtual mobility that Professor Dobers has mentioned before, we actually can introduce more student interaction into virtual exchanges in some cases than to some forms of international education, where a group of students would be supported and hosted by, let's say, an American professor, and who takes this group of students to France, where we have little student interaction because the students still learn from the American teacher. If this kind of international education is maybe prepared with a virtual exchange or embedded in some kind of other context, it can be much more impactful, and it can in that way also be more sustainable. Because in some ways, if we talk about the value of international education and assess these kind of activities, impact also, or if we have to measure the impact and the gains for students against the cost. And the cost is of course financial, but the cost is also in terms of environment and sustainability. And from what I could see in different discussions and conferences, these issues are much more available to everybody. They are, it's really intellectually, they can be felt more, and they are more considered by the different stakeholders in the area. maybe just to close, and I'm sorry if I have been a little bit long. From what we could see, the biggest obstacles really have been first the challenge to redesign curriculum and to go beyond simply transferring in-person classes to online classes. And the second challenge was simply to bring the technology equally to everybody. And that's really the digital divide I want to insist on, and I mentioned it earlier already. It's an access to reliable internet service and to functional hardware. And that seems to be very basic, especially since we're here like in this online webinar, but it is not. And in the field of international education, helping students to return safely or shelter in place in March 2020 was actually a big issue to many advisors we tend to forget about now because it's over a year ago. But this interruption of travel and led to an interruption of travel for a year, and it's kind of led to a self-questioning of the field of international education that is rather interesting today. I want to close with this self-questioning and hope to learn more from the other participants here.
That was great. Thank you, Ms. Gebhard. We will transition now to Professor Deutz from the Yorkshire University. And yeah, same thing, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you at the beginning. And we know you were the previous president of the ISDRS as well, but would love to hear about what you do and what you're working on. And then we'll go into your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gil. Thank you very much to the European Union Association for organising this event and inviting me to take part. I'm Professor of Human Geography at the University of Hull, also the Director of Studies for the Department of Geography, Geology and Environment. So I have had some role in this sort of transitioning to online teaching, and a lot of what we heard from the previous speaker rang very loudly as similar to the UK situation. Before I get to the UK situation, I'll just mention that my research concerns political economic aspects of resource efficiencies, which we now put under the title of the circular economy. And I'm the coordinator of an EU-funded project Cresting, which relates to circular economy and its sustainability implications with partners altogether in 6 countries. To tell you a little bit more about the University of Hull, is indeed in Yorkshire in the northeast of England. It's a small to medium-sized institution, or perhaps more small, probably on global standards. I think there's around 12 or 13,000 students currently. We maintain a research and teaching focus, which increasingly has become sort of divided in the UK. We teach and research across a range of disciplines, notably environment related from various perspectives. And I believe our 100th birthday is coming up later this decade. Anyway, moving on to my thoughts about COVID-19 pandemic and higher education in the UK, it's caused quite some strain. There have been similar sorts of difficulties, as we've heard in other places, that have also had a high incidence of COVID around student well-being, student experience, and indeed staff well-being, as we've largely continued to meet educational and research commitments. The possibly more unique circumstances here, I think, are around the pre-existing stresses that were in the system following a decade of turmoil around higher education since the introduction of fees that I will mention. And I don't believe the turmoil is over yet. So I'll give you some sort of background around the UK higher education. It's a highly politicized issue with also rather high financial stakes. The proportion of young people going to university has risen from 15 to 50% over the last 30, 40 years, encouraged by a deliberate policy of expansion by the government. Governments used to keep a tight rein on the number of places at each university, finding institutions that over-recruited. That's all gone now with limits raised and then removed, which has opened up much more urgent level of competition between universities, some of which are now literally bursting at the seams, others facing challenging times for recruitment. This exchange, or the exchange for universities for their expansion, was to demonstrate not just the relevance, but the actual impact of research, our government, industry, or cultural bodies responding to what we're demonstrating in our research findings, which is quite a sort of tough standard of relevance, let's say. There's possibly an uncomfortable balance for the government that this articulate and critical higher education community is actually needed as part of their process of upskilling the population for the much anticipated but not quite here knowledge economy. Alongside the expansion in student numbers nationally, there's been a shift of the charges for higher education, at least nominally, onto the student. So higher education has gone from being state funded with money for maintenance as well as there not being fees, to students paying fees of over £9,000 per year, implying that students undertake a huge level of personal debt with living costs, of course, on top of the fees. But the twist is that this money is borrowed from the government under quite protective terms. So graduates only start paying back when they reach a salary currently just over the average starting pay for graduates. So current modelling indicates that only just over half the money borrowed will ever be repaid. Universities are therefore simultaneously vulnerable to political decisions and also working with the student body who have the expectations of paying customers. Some studies indicate that not all students are going to be getting economic advantage from their degree over their lifetimes, which they very justifiably expect, even though we may try to recall that there are non-financial benefits to education as well. Now, in this competitive and market-oriented context, student satisfaction is paramount. This is measured each year by the National Student Survey, with the outcomes of which are then ranked by institution and subject, and plays into other wider rankings of institutions such as the Sunday Times or the Guardian newspaper list, which we at least assume are used by students in making their choices of where to apply. So huge borrowing has been undertaken by universities in recent years to fund expansion and refurbishment of campuses, rising expectations for standard of living accommodation, sports, library, social facilities, and therefore intense pressure to recruit students to pay back these loans. Enter into this already tense situation the pandemic. Campuses certainly closed, but universities did not. Work continued in, well, almost every possible way. Laboratory research was halted for a time, but alternative forms of instruction and examination were found so that students could complete their degrees with some flexibility from accreditation bodies around rules, such as for geology, where ordinarily students have to complete quite a stiff number of field days across their degree. That was relaxed under the circumstances. As with other institutions and individuals, we transferred to online teaching more or less overnight. This stretched both technology and, in all honesty, our ability to use it. In recent years, we have begun to record lectures live so students can refer back to them, and staff have not been particularly comfortable with the idea of being recorded. Suddenly, we were told to pre-record all lectures to avoid technical glitches during class or disadvantaging students with poor internet access. This style of teaching has been an enormous extra amount of work for staff. I mean, to give an example, it would take me literally 9 hours to convert a pre-existing lecture into some sort of handy lecture podcast for the students. But effectively, it's also more work for students too, as they would have watched lectures and maybe done other preparations before coming to class for some form of discussion or other activity, instead of coming along for a rather passive class and possibly some self-guided reading to follow up. So this form of blended learning, it's called, we think actually works very well in some cases. But the task is more challenging in fields with a practical element. Some of our teaching requires specialist software, and students can usually rely on being able to access that on campus. So we switched to online software, for example, geographic information systems, which is spatial data analysis, but it's quite demanding in computer terms. And likewise, the ingeniously designed virtual field trips. Field trips are a major component for Earth Science, Geography, and Environment degrees, but they're heavy in computing resources, and a virtual field trip definitely lacks the social aspects that you normally expect to come with fieldwork. Now, a few staff did have technological challenges at home, but generally we had access to the equipment we needed. Whereas, as Katrin mentioned, for a significant number of students, they did not. They might be sharing a laptop with parents or siblings, or actually doing their assignments on a smartphone. We had a roundup of laptops from across the faculty that was sent out to students struggling with equipment. It's more difficult to fix local shortcomings in internet connectivity. So there have been knock-on effects on student and staff, mental health, both from the isolation of lockdown, especially for international students, sometimes stranded alone, as well as the economic stresses, family illness, bereavement, and just a greater difficulty of working under less than ideal circumstances. And so we took steps like relaxing the process of getting an extension on assessed work to help reduce stress. And a significant number of students took advantage of that. But unfortunately, some are still trying to make up the backlog of work, which has various complications in a system that's built around the assumption that students all progress together year from year through their degrees. Now, inevitably, the question of value for money for university education has been raised. Students actually in the main have been very understanding of the circumstances, and we've received some of our most positive teaching evaluations. But at an institutional level, there have been questions around the money paid for facilities on campus to which there's no longer any access. But as mentioned, universities have saved very little or no money, with a rather small proportion of staff on furlough and a loss of income from accommodation and reduction in international student numbers, as well as having to buy technology and software and so on. Some of the question of value is centered around the non-academic aspects of the student experience, which of course have been severely curtailed during lockdowns. 80% of UK students live away from home, and this provides a sort of sheltered introduction to the independence of adult life with the freedoms that that brings, and it's a major part of the university experience. And universities, of course, benefit in recruitment terms by the enthusiasm for the student experience, which sometimes outweighs the enthusiasm for studying. But the value of that is a bit intangible, and it's not something directly within the gift or responsibilities of universities. I think I will move down a bit here. So finally, I'd just like to mention, again, which may be a relatively unusual feature of UK higher education, how students progress from school to university. So they apply for university during their final year at school. Universities offer places on the basis of grades predicted by teachers. Exams are set in the early summer, places at university confirmed in August, ready to start the term in September. Now, public schools exams were cancelled early in the pandemic, partly itself a public health measure, but also in response to decidedly unequal educational experiences in lockdown. But this then had huge implications for higher education. Teachers tend to be generous in their predictions, so universities overoffer, leaving the exams to sort out who ultimately secures a place where. But that becomes very tricky without the exams. How to decide which individuals' predicted grades should be lowered. The algorithm selected used schools' recent achievements, thereby perpetuating the success of higher attaining schools, which possibly fee-paying schools or in more prosperous neighbourhoods. So several days of protest resulted from the inequities of that algorithm, resulted finally in all students being awarded their predicted grades. Some universities then truly did have more students than they could cope with, especially in sort of very practical medical courses, for example. So they had to pay some students to defer. There's been a similar situation this year, still with teacher-based predictions, but based on specific evidence, but still with grade inflation and with it over-recruitment at some institutions. There's been a certain amount of discussion about overcrowding in those universities. Now, in some cases, busing in students from vacant accommodation elsewhere. Less of a conversation about the undercrowding in the universities who would have offered places and top class experience to students who might have been normally rejected by their first class institution. So to conclude, this September, with vaccinations offered over the summer to 17 and 18-year-olds, we're trying to operate pretty much as normal. Our one-way systems have gone, social distancing is voluntary and rather difficult. In places, masks are encouraged, but more favoured by staff than students. And we are trying to incorporate some of the lessons of blended learning that we trialled in lockdown, and we've laid on extra skill sessions and field trips to try and provide some of those experiences that have been missed. But the underlying processes of adjustment in the sector have certainly not gone away. I felt sort of more than ever we're really not in a sustainable situation, let's say. So I feel we need to decide what the real purpose of education is and how it should be paid for, and to recognise the support that is needed, which will vary between different students and may be provided best by different types of institution. And with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Again, this was very insightful. It's amazing to think of all the challenges, both academically and logistically, and sometimes hard to wrap our head around all the background that's happening to make things happen, and the challenges that both the staff and students go through. But thank you so much. With that, I will pass it on to Dr. Perkins from Missouri State University, who will kind of conclude as a panelist, but also will moderate the final part for the Q&A at the end. So with that, yeah, feel free to also please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing. Dr. Perkins, thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This whole talk has been very insightful, listening to all the different experiences everyone is having, at the university, and many of the experiences my university are the same. I'm going to talk about those in just a moment, but let me introduce myself. Of course, as Akil said, I'm David Perkins. I'm the sustainability director at the university, but also my research specialty is sustainable tourism. And if I do have time at the end of my brief talk here, I will sort of touch upon some elements of sustainability and how they're intersecting with the tourism sector. But let me go ahead and start just about what I do at the university and what I've experienced. So my university is approximately 25,000 students here in the middle of America in Missouri, which is in Springfield, Missouri. And so we've experienced, as we've seen, a lot of the same things around the world, really. We've seen struggles with enrollment, struggles with students who are indeed needing access to different technologies. So I'm going to kind of mix my talk with positives and negatives that I've observed. One of the positive things, of course, we have seen increased enrollments in graduate students. In fact, we're peaking in the number of graduate students enrolled in the university at the moment. That's promising for the future, of course, because we're talking about increased research, which is down due to COVID right now. Of course, there's also the relationship between joblessness and increased enrollments in graduate students. So we do recognize that as well. A lot of times, of course, since the jobs aren't there as normal, right now, what that does is encourages people to enter grad school. So it does have its positive and negative effects. In terms of how we've treated COVID at our university, it's much the same as everywhere else. To begin the pandemic, so to speak, we, of course, reverted to an online-only type option where we all, as professors, were scrambling to, learn the latest technology and get people involved in that way. And though there was a learning curve, I have seen some positive elements come about that we've already touched upon, but the ability to use technology and kind of be forced to use that technology is improving our ability to reach different students that are out there, students that in any normal non-pandemic type of situation might not necessarily have the appropriate access to university. We have a lot of students at our university who indeed work full-time jobs. And so having these delivery methods on the side to allow them more flexibility in their schedules actually helped them in many ways. So I've seen a lot of good things with that. Of course, we've learned a lot from hybrid learning techniques, having students in the classroom for certain circumstances and then filling out their education outside. I know one, instance that is, I'm fairly new faculty, but one of the things that I've learned with the students is that by reverting to a lot of online tools, having them write in forums or using things of that nature, I'm recognizing that there are, many students with many different learning types. Oftentimes when you have large lectures and you're teaching these students, you hear the students that raise their hand, you hear the students that speak up, and then you start to sort of understand your class in a certain way. With the increase in online technologies, students that were formerly silent are no longer as silent. Maybe because they're just uncomfortable speaking in class, or maybe that they are better at expressing their thoughts in writing. But what I have noticed, which is pretty encouraging, is to see lots of students that I would say weren't normally forefront in our classrooms, that are able to really communicate well on online forums. And it's quite encouraging to see that. And I think, as I've discussed with several of the students, they, it gives everyone an outlet to sort of meld their learning experience to a comfort level that they have. So we have writers, we have talkers, and everyone is able to sort of be in a more inclusive type environment, which is really good. So those have been some of the good things associated with that. Another thing, as we all know here in our panelists, we like to go to conferences to share our research. One of the key things, though, that students, of course, struggle with is the cost of going to conferences in the past. Being able to fund to go to these areas. Now, though, with more and more academic conferences, professional conferences that are being put online, it gives a greater opportunity for, well, us and also students to engage at different levels that they weren't normally exposed to in the past. So I have seen, a benefit from that. With all of this, of course, we do understand that not having the interpersonal interactions does degrade the learning experience. My students are slowly getting back. We are having, increased enrollments and increased participation in all of the lectures. They're getting back to a more normal type of response. However, talking to them, experiencing, the classroom environment, this pandemic has really decreased the ability for students to collaborate, to work in teams, to sort of have group type learning that really facilitates their, transition from the university to the workplace. Because as we all know, we tend to work in teams, right? Once we do, graduate beyond the university. Not having that at the university is a key skill that is being neglected, that we've, struggled with. And we try to, of course, work on it with technology. But indeed, I find it apparent in my classrooms that social isolation, the inability to sort of, network and come up with different ideas too, is also an important sort of idea when it relates to sustainability and how we, adhere to partnerships, just referring to SDG number 17. As we transition back to increased enrollments, the universities, of course, are struggling with balancing appropriate, health measures, I'll call them, versus, of course, revenues. Our university president recently announced, of course, they're not going to mandate vaccines. And, some people agree, some people don't with that. But the justification, of course, is that mandating vaccines at our university will cost us money because it will decrease enrollment. And of course, they are able to tell us how much that impacts, the overall operational structure of the university. So we do see that because of lowered enrollments, we have less flexibility to sort of, we'll say, hit the ground running post-pandemic as we want to pull ourselves out of this. As Peter mentioned a little bit earlier, there is a bit of stress, of course, that's exercised on a lot of the faculty. Converting things over to these digital formats is one issue. One thing we're seeing at our university, of course, is some of our faculty that are nearing the retirement age or are already there and kind of just, continuing to teach, are starting to take early retirement. They're starting to retire a little bit earlier than we would expect. My department in particular, we're losing several faculty just as a result of retirements. And, speaking candidly with some of these people, you could tell they're tired and they're losing that sort of joy of teaching just because of the stresses involved in this situation. So we are running into some issues with that. Sort of tying this back onto the idea of sustainability, because we're starting a center on my campus, we're trying to engage more and more students. One of the positive things I'm seeing with this pandemic is it serves somewhat as a great equalizer in terms of putting everyone, in an understanding that we're all kind of in this together. It teaches my students a little bit more about the social aspects of sustainability, how in order to, beat this, this virus, we have to work together. We have to understand the structures of our society. And I think it's resonating with them. I try to emphasize this, in all my student interactions in class and what have you. I find it to be really kind of bridging the gap between the former understanding of sustainability as, heavy in environment, which of course it is, but it's allowing more and more people to connect with and understand the importance of, we'll call them the 3 pillars within sustainability, connecting those to sustainable development goals. I think they're making better connections now, because simply we all kind of are in this together. And I see some positive aspects as a result of that. So with that, I want to just transition a little bit to tourism and sort of my research and what I'm seeing in terms of the industry. Of course, tourism is an important vehicle that's used for sustainable development. Tourism, if you contact the UNWTO, World Tourism Organization, they will tell you that 1 in 10 jobs is tourism related. You don't have to be in the hospitality, industry to be part of the tourism sector. You can be part of the service providers that connect all of this. Shutting down, the global travel of everybody impacts many, many lives and many jobs. As we all have experienced, if you do go onto the Sustainable Development Goals website, with the United Nations, you'll see how we have externalities as a result of shutdowns and the pandemic. Not only are we having to deal with all of the health problems, of course, we're seeing today, we're seeing how the other elements, whether it's, joblessness or, access to food or, women's empowerment, all of these are suffering as a result of COVID, for many different reasons. But we do see that when we look at the development of tourism in small communities, quite frankly, it's suffering significantly because people aren't able to travel. So as a result, the bounce back that they call it, get vaccinated and start to travel again, is slow, is a relatively slow process. But one of the things, as I alluded to earlier with the university, this is sort of an unprecedented opportunity, I would like to call it, because we can think of it almost as a great reset in the tourism sector. As a whole, it has elements of sustainability, but it's not that great in terms of how the environment is respected, how cultures are respected. And when we do have this opportunity to sort of pause the world in many ways, we can reset in a way to sort of right our path. And so that's a lot of the discussion out there within this particular field. One final point to mention regarding tourism is that since a lot of us are not able to travel internationally for, obvious reasons, it has done many things to develop domestic forms of tourism. And we need to think of that and how it can really boost our feelings of society, our, enhancement of own local culture. Because oftentimes that does get neglected, not only in the tourism field, but just in general, understanding, how to round out problems that we have at home that need to be fixed. And at home, I mean, your nation of residence or, wherever you happen to live. And so it gives us those unique opportunities as well to sort of be more introspective in how we can solve global challenges and move from that. So with that, I think I've got to just about the end of my time here. So I will go ahead and let Akil lead us into the question and answer, and I'll help moderate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perkins, for your perspective. Definitely added a new perspective to what we've heard already from different angles. So that was super helpful. Let me make you the host. And just to kind of do a transition here, what I would like to do, and Dr. Perkins, please take it over from here, but would be ideal if the panelists have questions to each other And I know, Dr. Perkins, you may have also questions yourself, and then we can open it up to attendees where anyone in the attendees, please feel free to use the Q&A part in the Zoom to start posting your questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pivot just a slight amount because I did research on all of our panelists. But one thing that I encounter a lot talking to students is the idea of planned obsolescence. And I know we have some experts here in the circular economy. For those who are listening in that aren't familiar with planned obsolescence, the easiest analogy would be, can you still use a computer that was built 10 years ago? Generally no, because things get outdated, things get processed. The question that I have from students is that how can we, maintain sustainability and a lack of, resource production when our society is built around making new things continuously. The success of a business will struggle, obviously, as a result of making something that doesn't need to be purchased again for 20 years. And so I get that a lot in my classroom, so I figured I'd ask our experts.
Quick answer might be perhaps that's an incredibly expensive item that's made. I mean, that would be my fear, perhaps, that it is costing 10 times as much as the one that you would have bought every other year. If we want to avoid that, certainly in terms of sort of the social issues that we've touched on, then I think we probably need rather more fundamental alteration to society. We're not going to be able to just operate as we've got used to with some tweaks and expect that that will make us more sustainable. I think that there'll be more radical alteration to how we run ourselves and our societies. Of course, vast room for disagreement on exactly how that might be done. So I'm not expecting a quick transformation.
Yeah, that leads me really to think about a lot of elements out there in terms of sustainability, how we relay it to our students, how the universities take it as a research sort of agenda. And how do you find the philosophy overall of sustainability, the mindset of everyone to be affected by COVID? Are you noticing that, like I said, I feel that people are starting to understand the social issues a little bit more. We have all these stories out here about how the environment in some cases seems to be improving as a result of decreased traffic and movement. How are all of you viewing this in terms of people's maybe acceptance of sustainability or, understanding of what it really is?
Well, I can answer. I think that people have, well, my feeling is that COVID has blown open problems that pre-existed. And as I think various have mentioned, those who were disadvantaged already are more disadvantaged and so forth. And so we can appreciate things better than we used to. But at the same time, I feel that there's a desperate urgency for things to kind of get back to some sort of normal. So I'm afraid that we're going to miss the opportunity to maybe capture some benefits, perhaps we hope medical ones, but I feel that in 5 years' time, we might look back and feel that we've maybe let some opportunity slip. Climate change, okay, so that's way up the agenda because we're looking forward to COP26 now just next month, so that's getting a certain amount of traction on the airwaves, but there's much more discussion, let's say right now, about the high price of gas and what are we going to do about the high price of gas, whereas we ought to perhaps be thinking, oh, we shouldn't be using gas, but there's too much preoccupation with some of these sort of immediate issues, and maybe Britain's got more than its share of those at the minute for reasons that might be related to something being with B, but there's certainly large scale yeah, we're not sort of taking the opportunity that I think we might have thought would be here from a moment of crisis that we might be able to grasp hold of and move forward in a different way.
Any other panelists would like to share their thoughts on this topic? Peter, I see your hands raised.
Yeah, both of my hands, my electronic and my physical hand. Well, one thing that we have talked a lot about at Södertörn University is the sort of the role of scholars at higher education institutions and how that may change. We're used to conducting research. We're used to teaching out new findings. We're used to all that. But now, after we have sort of the sciences of many tens of thousands of scholars in natural and environmental sciences pointing out the facts of climate change, at least in my opinion, being a social scientist, we know exactly that we have a problem. Still, we are, as probably the most famous Swede of all these years, Greta Thunberg, say, we do too little. So I am encountering in my faculty, I'm encountering many academics that want in a way to become activists. You know, they leave their objective, so-called objective research behind and would like to change things much faster. So that's a question that we have been discussing a lot. And in order for us at the Södertörn University to actually allow the many teachers that are not so well into sustainability and the sustainable development goals as possibly are the 7 on this panel that are clearly interested in this. We are actually having a series of 20 seminars where we invite all faculty and all administrative staff as well to learn more about each and every of the 17 sustainable development goals and have another 3 seminars of the goal conflicts that, for instance, internationalization and tourism may have on the sustainable development agenda. And we are just inviting them to be part of that and to get a knowledge themselves and share what kind of methods in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of examining the competences of sustainability that we are trying to provide students are good. And that's all we can. That's all we can do. My faculty board has tried to convince the board of forcing upon the teachers learning outcomes that are forced in terms of sustainable development. And let me say this bluntly, the academic freedom of teachers and scholars to do whatever they want to is a massive force against that. And they may be right, but still things are too slow. We need to start acting.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate your response there. I've actually sent surveys out to some of the faculty in my university, and I think from those surveys, we learn that people are teaching about sustainability and don't even know it most of the time. So I think the aspect of having those seminar series is a great idea, and I wrote that down for a possible suggestion at Missouri State. Would anyone else like to answer this on this topic? Otherwise, I can move on. There are a few questions in the Q&A from our audience. Okay. Well, let me ask the first question that was posed to us in the Q&A here. Of course, sustainability, I think we all probably struggle with describing it to people, right? It seems like a broad concept, and if we're not careful, it seems like it's something that applies to everyone and everything, every topic out there. So what in sustainability would you say we should discuss as being the top and most urgent things globally? We've already touched on climate change a little bit, and of course we can expand on that, but are there others?
I think the other bit of medical good news, I mean, not saying the pandemic was the good news, but we've done some very swift medical research in response to the pandemic. But today we hear about a malaria vaccine, and so that has to be a very welcome thing, and a shame that that's taken quite so long to get to where it has. But that sort of international development issues, I think I would rank as being very important.
Peter, yes.
Well, I really think that what is missing is nothing new, but it is a functioning global governance that can actually start distributing wealth and resources from richer parts of the world to less richer parts of the world, in order for them to make this wonderful step that many countries of ours have been taking in terms of industrialization, in terms of spreading lots of carbon dioxide, etc. And I don't see how we can do that. And I don't see how we can do that with a majority of voters behind us in the way we are set up, in at least in democracies like in Europe. I have no answer, but I just realized that that is an important aspect to start leveling out some of the inequalities of the world.
Oh, I think, yeah, that was a very good point, and that's really like, that would be a bold step to take. In a lot of conversations I can have around sustainability in general, what I found the most difficult is everybody agrees sustainability is great and we need that, but then when it comes to what can you actually do as an individual, and us agreeing to such a bold suggestion would be one step, but even then in our own lives, what can we actually do to make steps towards, or to take action towards sustainability? I find that the hardest. But I can see, for instance, we as the French embassy, we invite speakers and they come over to give a talk and these kind of things. And nowadays, more and more of them are saying that they will not come over, actually, and they will not accept an invitation for just 1 hour or 2 hours, and that these invitations have to be more impactful to actually be, yeah, so we actually can pay the environmental cost for these kind of things. And also in terms of equality, I can see more and more initiatives to make sure that who are we giving the word to, who are we giving a platform to, who can speak. And that is even more, that's an important issue in terms of course, gender equality and other kinds of more, yeah, diversity and inclusion. And these are small steps that we can take as institutions who program cultural events, but that's also true for universities who organize this, who organizes scientific and knowledge outreach.
Great, thank you. I've got another question in our chat. So I'll start with the beginning of it. What is the silver lining of this pandemic? Our person writing here mentioned that they are seeing the acceleration of hybrid education and, of course, some of the benefits associated with that. So would someone like to talk about their viewpoints here?
I mean, I can go first on this one. And in my opinion, yes. So everybody in the field of international education and in universities in general being much more comfortable now with the technological opportunities that exist. And many, even though many are tired and torn, as you said earlier, many are also really, they have learned something and they don't want to go back to just everything as before and forget about everything they have learned or we have learned. And that is really how to use technology to interact with each other, domestically or globally. And hopefully, I hope this really will stick around, because we need to talk to each other. And The opportunities and the tools for communication are there, and we don't always need to fly over to actually have a thoughtful, meaningful conversation and to change people's and students' perspectives.
I would totally agree with that, that we've found that you can communicate in this way and it works wonderfully and is, of course, a great saving in time, money and carbon compared to taking a 10-hour flight or whatever the alternative might be. But I have to say, I also miss the human interaction, and I wouldn't mind attending something in person, I think. And I must admit, I have something in mind coming up this year that I keep every finger crossed that people are able to travel. So it will be a case of finding a balance in the future, I think. And people have talked about over the years, you know, individual carbon budgets, perhaps, so you can take one flight per year. I don't know how you police that, and of course with all these things you can tax them, but you immediately just favor the people who could pay over the ones who can't, and so forth. So maybe having some sort of individual rationing system would be good. There's a lot of people these days have family living in different countries, and it's not a sort of a case of an extravagant holiday. It's actually wanting to go and meet up with your loved ones. So I think banning travel would be draconian.
Well, just responding to that a little on a personal note is that from my home office, life has become so much smaller in the sense of my scope of traveling has really decreased so much. And when my university and the pandemic COVID-19 staff was informing about the small steps we are now taking, going back sort of to an on-campus learning situation and start inviting us back, they have asked us to do this incrementally in small steps, you know, not all at the same time. And I was sort of laughing at that internally, of having that is a very Swedish, nice, mellow way of, you know, doing it, a small path. But actually, when traveling a couple of times now from last summer to campus in commuter trains, 25 minutes, I get it. It is not easy for everyone to come back to the old routines, because it has been long enough of a time to start changing habits. And those changing habits in terms of tourism, in terms of traveling, have, at least in my life and in my family, set some deep links in terms of what we are thinking. We may be changing in a year or two from now, but my family says that we won't be flying in Europe anymore. If necessary, we will take train, and we would love to do that. And we will allow the time for that to do that. So things have changed. I think the habits are changing, and whether that is enough for the major changes, I don't know. But studies show that, you know, during the lockdowns and home office confinements, the carbon dioxide levels in many cities all over the world was much better. But the climate experts say in the short run, maybe yes, but in the long run, nothing has changed. And we need to do this every year and twice as much. So, you know, how should we do that in terms of reduction?
I think one thing that Pauline mentioned a moment ago that we're kind of all touching on here is we're getting these incremental changes in our outlooks and how we value things in our economy or in our society. And one of the things, you know, I think that the allowing us to kind of push pause on a lot of our travel and all that does make us think for a moment, do you really need to go to this place? Now that we have technologies, for example, to go to a lot of conferences, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's probably, I would say, from the administration standpoint in a university, makes them question how much conference funding they should provide for people to travel. And so, and also, you know, as a person who, you know, travels to go to conferences, it makes me wonder, well, maybe I could just stay at home a little more often and only for maybe one conference a year travel to it. And the other ones, I could use them as gains of knowledge. So I see a lot of this as being sort of incremental change in our overall outlook. But like Peter was just mentioning, we really, you know, we're way behind the 8 ball, as you say. And so in order for us to really achieve a lot of these goals, you know, we need to have behavioral change, and we can't just go back to the way things were in an effort to sort of restart things quickly. I'm reminded of, I can't remember the name of the hurricane that devastated Puerto Rico a few years ago, but I'm reminded that it essentially destroyed their power grid. And they had a really good opportunity to rebuild it in a more sustainable way using some renewables. And well, because they were in a hurry to get things back to normal, which of course is also understandable, they kind of just built it back the way it always has been. And there was a huge opportunity lost there in terms of, you know, getting things righted in a more sustainable way for the future. So I think, you know, understanding that we are going to miss opportunities, but it's also good to really, you know, think about how this can start changing people's behaviors and outlooks, and maybe make these things a little bit more personal to them, so people can actually make these connections and understand the way other parts of the world are starting to, you know, interact with us, and of course with you know, the global pandemic.
Right. The ISDRS Society, we were very happy that Columbia University in New York hosted the conference in, I believe it was in 2011, Pauline, where the Earth Institute and Jeffrey Sachs was the host. And I'm very happy about one of the questions, or actually comments by Bodan, about the SDG Academy. And it's very inspiring to see that you and 14 other leading North American universities have tried to come up with this hybrid education project. And I'm very much looking forward to check that out, Bodan, and thank you for your email address as well, because it may be a very, very positive way of reaching out and including scholarships from all over the world, actually, as some of you have phrased beforehand, that this is an opportunity. One example is when PhD students defend their theses. Obviously, we have one opponent that is discussing that, and we have a grading committee of 3 persons. We have seen that the participation in these events is much higher than before. We are seeing that the participation of the 4 main characters, 1 discussant and the 3 at the grading committee, has become much more international. And in terms of academia, internationalization is most of the time always a good thing in terms of checking off the academic credentials and standards. So, you know, the hybrid elements or the online elements are becoming much more usual, and we're getting used to that. The only thing that I really miss about this is actually the socializing elements of the students. Some of you have mentioned that briefly, that what we are sort of missing is actually the contacts with the students. And let me see where I had a little comment for myself on that. I see. Well, I will come back to that. Yeah.
Great. Let's see. I am looking through the comments here. I just want to mention that Bodan has, as Peter mentioned, included his email address there. And so we're going to move on to another question here on our list. And it says, you know, is the pandemic an opportunity to provide higher education to underdeveloped countries at reduced cost, so students can indeed take classes from their homes? And, you know, we talk a lot about how the internationalization opportunities have gone up. At my university, we had, we're actively having these partnerships, sort of collaboration opportunities with other universities in different countries that, you know, normally we'd only be able to send 5 students as a study away, study abroad type of experience, but now we're actually able to have this type of relationship. So what do y'all see in terms of that? How can you, you know, how do we use this as an opportunity?
Yeah, I'm from France. We actually have an interesting initiative. It's also relevant for the French context, because in France there are some zones that are maybe a little bit further away from universities, and it's harder to access for students. So there's an initiative building connected campuses. So that means in these campuses, students, they would still take online classes, online degrees, but then they can socialize in these campuses with other students from the same region, staying close to home, and still have like a tutor in place at these connected campuses. And that might be a way of responding actually to the need for socializing, because it is a need, and it helps students to get out of their own discipline and to have a broader education beyond really what they learn in classes, and at the same time get the quality degrees that they need to. And this is an initiative that has started in France and has been developed there. But now some of these campuses are actually built internationally. So we have like one of the first ones of a French connected campus was opened in Mexico during the pandemic, and we have that in other countries as well. And I find that a rather interesting decision, because it really helps to encourage online education, but without leaving the students completely isolated and leaving them on their own.
Let me make a comment on that. I really think that is important. And under the presidency of Professor Deutz, ISDRS worked very committedly with inclusion of scholars from low and middle income countries. And at the ISDRS board meeting in Nanjing in China in 2019, we realized at the board meeting that we actually needed to become much better in offering this online stream at our on-campus annual conferences. So no way did we anticipate that we would see 2 online-only conferences in 2020 and 2021 come our way. And at the next conference on the topic of sustainable development and courage, culture, art, and human rights coming up in 22, we must have a hybrid event. And that links to what Katrin says, that links to what Bodan said, and what I am missing. What I'm missing of the online issue is that education, yes, provides substance. We can do that online. It provides a knowledge context. Yes, we can also do that online. We can provide education on campus, provides a social and a togetherness, and that works quite or pretty good, but not all the way, as Pauline has said. But what is really missing, I think, in terms of what we can provide students with an opportunity, that is self-confidence, and be working on their own self-confidence as a voice of change, as Bodan wrote as well about Greta Thunberg and others that want change, that not have any formal positions yet. Because the self-confidence is all about daring to speak in front of others, to feel that one's voice means something, that one is worth listening to, and that one can and must take place in social context. And that is just harder online. It's harder to get through the 2-dimensional screen in terms of getting a message across, feeling empathy to people, and chatting with them over a coffee. We don't do that, and that is just missing. That's what I'm missing out with not being on the campus. To see students and their self-realization and liberation as humans, and empowering them to become citizens not only of a nation, but also of a globe, and trying to pursue their inner voices.
I just wanted to add like another aspect if we're talking about opportunities for international education and online education for European universities or American universities. I would also stress that in terms of sustainability, what is very important is that these kind of initiatives are linked to local universities, so that we actually strengthen the universities and the knowledge society in all countries to get to innovation, to get to these kind of things, and to develop industry and infrastructure, because that is a more systemic approach if we actually get to the institutional level and go beyond just impacting individuals with the education.
Yes, I would very much agree with that. It's not just sort of packaging or selling packages or even giving away packages of education from the richer countries who've got the technology. I mean, an immediate issue being access to technology in the poorer countries that need the education to go with it. But definitely it's about strengthening the educational institutions in those countries and kind of letting the different points of view enter into the global discussion as well.
Just to play off what Peter was saying earlier as well, I more and more finding that the interpersonal interactions with students are the things that they are lacking. I said this in my initial, outline, but, one of the things we're not only, teaching students, giving them knowledge for success, but we're giving them, the appropriate socialization, like I said, to work on teams, to, understand things of that nature. And so, now I think that that's, definitely something that we can't necessarily quantify, but something that is very important to, when we can't meet, trying our hardest really to get these type of interactions, to be very important and, forefront in our research and everything else. So I want to sort of course, emphasize that. I think at this point, it's good to see if any of the panelists have questions for any of the other panelists. I know we've been talking a lot about things, and maybe, oops, I'm sorry. I think I muted part of that. But yeah, if any of you have questions for the other panelists right now, let's go ahead and open it up for that and see what everyone would like to share or discuss.
Nothing comes to mind, I'm afraid.
I must say, I'm still thinking about new business models that can be more sustainable than selling more of the same thing. Isn't it more value, or how can we redefine value, or think about business models where actually reparation is part of the process and part of what we sell? Or that's not so new. It's maybe going back to something old, but it might be actually revolutionizing what we do if things can be repaired. And who would have thought that somebody by selling ads can build like $1 billion empire called Facebook? And I think that was a business model we didn't see coming, and hopefully somebody will be as inventive for sustainability and or we use the business models that are already out there and we don't know yet about and scale them up.
I have a question for Katrin, actually. I mean, Pauline and we are from academia, so we get it. We understand the limitations of not traveling, and it's I'm very happy for your event that will take place. Is it possibly a cresting conference?
Yes, in December in London, if anyone happens to be in the neighborhood.
Yes, that would be lovely. But now to Katrin, because you're in diplomacy, aren't you? I mean, you're part of the diplomacy processes, and I cannot really see that because it is a world that I'm not part of, see that missing out on traveling only. I mean, how do you turn diplomacy which is so much about getting to know people, building relations. How is that possible in an online, mainly online world?
That's a good question. Yes, yeah, and networking was supposed to be one of my main occupations, in kind of in a way. A lot of that has switched online. I must say, it's a lot of Zoom conversations, and some way because before the pandemic, and we have been maybe in diplomacy and public administration a little bit lacking behind. Before that, we used a lot the telephone, and now video conferences made that actually easier to connect because you can actually see people and build a connection. But a lot of these conversations have to happen online, and it's very weird because I call people, I have to, and even now people think it's easier from, I'm actually based in New York, and so even when people are in Brooklyn, that's an hour away, they prefer to do the online conversation because they think that's just the hour of transportation is like impacting their day too much in some ways. But on the other hand, some people are now keen to get back, and I mean, we're hosting a little event tonight where actually 70 people responded from science, and we're very happy to have all those scholars coming to us tonight, and I can see people are keen on coming back.
Good.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll ask one question of all the panelists, and this is just all of our outlooks. Are there any ongoing projects that you're working on at the moment or planning on working on that look into these areas? What are you doing? I'll go ahead and answer the question to give everyone a chance to think about that. But what I'm doing right now is I'm looking at various development projects around the globe when it comes to tourism and how they're sort of able to do that reset, how they're able to start integrating sustainability into their marketing plans so they don't get overrun, for example, after after we open back up. So I'm helping with that. Another thing that I'm looking at, I mentioned earlier, domestic tourism and sort of one's, pride of an area has an opportunity for improvement right now. So I'm also doing a lot of, cultural heritage type of sustainability work to where I'm, having people, understand where they're from and, kind of the benefits of the local. Because we all know, the elements of, the economy, keeping things local are very key things in many aspects of sustainability. So that's kind of where I'm going right now in terms of my research in the short term as we sort of progress into sustainability and post-pandemic. So I'll stop there and curious what everyone else is doing.
I can go first. So one of the projects we're working on is actually bringing community college students to France. And so that's in a way, it helps us to provide quality education and quality international education to a group that is typically missed out on. And I would really think that we are the ones missing out on them, and also the other way around. And actually they will learn a lot with us and work with us on different aspects of sustainability. Some will work on local food and local agriculture and how this can be more sustainable. Others more on architecture and sustainability. We'll have something on transport and urban smart cities in a way. And that is our project for next summer. And we'll start promoting that to students, and hopefully we'll have some good participation.
Well, thank you. If I go next, so I have two answers, perhaps. One, an educational one. So at the university, we are going through a process of trying to make sure that the sustainability, which, as you mentioned, David, we might be teaching more or less consciously, becomes very explicit, so that this is a key part of what we're doing. For a discipline like geography that kind of looks at the relationships between society and environment should be way out there in the vanguard of that. And I think we get it's slightly under wraps too much. So, most of the modules in our department, for example, are about climate change or responses to it in some way. Now, here's a question. Should we rename the whole program climate change, or do we stick with our brand? So we're grappling with that one at the moment. The research answer, and Peter kindly advertised my conference. I will put it in the chat for everyone. 15th of December, free online, or £25, which is pretty much of a bargain if you're in London. I reported back on 15 PhDs around the circular economy and how sustainable is it? What type of jobs might be created or lost? How can social enterprises be involved in generating a circular economy? Can particular cities like Hull, for example, benefit from circular initiatives, or do the potential financial benefits sort of become distributed by companies through their supply chain? So these are the types of issues that people have been investigating. Thank you.
Well, great efforts. I wish all three of you best luck for your efforts. My small task for the next year or for the next 8 months is something that Pauline may anticipate what it is about to be, but it is our next conference that will be in Stockholm, and which will be on the topic that I just briefly mentioned on sustainable development and courage, culture, art, and human rights, by which we would like to bring in the humanities much more than we have in the previous decades of discussions on sustainability. And we will also try to have the science-based research be linked and be stimulated by the artistic-based research from our scholars at the Stockholm Uni Arts and their colleagues internationally as well. So it will be a very nice, interesting conference indeed. But the challenge that I'm bringing to this table is, of course, how do you do that hybrid thing in a good way? I mean, it's hard. It's really hard. And I hope that I can see several of you actually in Stockholm walking around. And by the way, David, we also end our conferences with a day of sustainability tours, by which you can network and continue socializing once you have done your travel part. So also that will be put in the link for anyone that interested in the conference part of the world.
That's great to hear. I'm excited by all that we've learned today in the question and answer. And Pauline, just so you know, we're I'm in the Geography, Geology, and Planning department, and I'm a geographer. I think I mentioned that earlier, but we're changing the name of our major to Geography and Sustainability. So I'm hoping that that's going to really encourage a lot of movement, and I can keep you posted on how it helps our enrollments.
Oh, could I just say on that very subject, sorry if this is a bit dull for other people, but theory that's 18-year-olds don't know the word sustainability. So however enthusiastic they are about everything that we associate with that, it won't necessarily drive them to come to your course because they won't know what it means. But well, let's see.
Yeah, exactly. I know it's a real struggle trying to get this term, you know, a degree of understanding. And so we'll do our best.
I want to add, if I can, a little note.
Yes, Giuseppe, please end with the EU Association remarks. I just want to mention that it was an absolute pleasure meeting all of you virtually, though, hopefully at some conference in the future in person. It's been a pleasure. I think it was really extremely informative, and I think we learned a lot today, as David has mentioned. So, Giuseppe, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, I'm obviously. First of all, allow me to thank you and Sarah for being part of this team for this particular event. Without your support, we would not have been able to make this a reality. And I'm delighted that we organize this event because the subject is one of the priorities of the United Nations. It's a shift, a global shift that's happening today in the world toward a sustainable development that is being taken always more and more seriously. Now, I wanted to say we have an opportunity after this event today, in which I obviously thank very much Katrin for the French Embassy for being so kind. We already have an old cooperation with her. Same thing with Peter Dobers for ISDRS, which I'm glad that we are in a partnership with that. And Pauline, needless to say, we already work together. She's essential and now is extremely kind and available, although she's busy, but so. And obviously, Professor Perkins, David, thank you so much for giving us the US perspective, extremely important, and for your insights, which were absolutely essential to the discussion. So I wanted to just say the last note that we are trying to put together an event. This event was mostly European and US perspectives, obviously, but we might have, we're trying to assemble another event at the end of the month in which we include the United Nations perspective. We have the honor to have an acceptance by the Assistant Secretary General, Ms. Dr. Spatolisano, which is a senior DESA representative, and she will be available on the 27th or the 28th. And we were thinking, thanks to the support of also of the ISDRS colleagues, to have a perspective from Vietnam and from some Asian professors as well. This will give us the possibility to encompass most of the planet, or a good part of it, that is the transatlantic and the Eurasian perspective. And so we'll keep you informed, but we are planning to do that. And in that case, we'll have not only the academic point of view, but also the United Nations senior position on how the global institutions are dealing and how they think they can take advantage for what's been learned for the future on sustainability and on the pandemic addressing. So this is just I wanted to share with you. I think it's important that we could expand on this subject. Then after that, I would like to thank you very, very much for giving us your time, as very busy as your time is. And I look forward to a future cooperation together, okay? Have a good, nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will post the video on our website, and for all the attendees, please look out for that as well. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right. Great done. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.